afternoon and good evening to all of you if you are joining us in this virtual meeting from different time zones. I also would like to welcome the Secretary-General of the United Nations, welcome the Deputy Secretary-General, welcome the Chef de Cabinet, Maria Luisa Ribeiro Voti, welcome Senior Advisor on Policy, Ana Maria Menendez. Thank you for being part of this highly anticipated town hall. We hope that in 2022, we will be together and we'll be able to meet in person. We also want from the onset to express our solidarity to all those of you who have been affected by the pandemic, whether you have lost a job, whether you have experienced violence, or whether you have lost a loved one. We also want to extend our appreciation for all the work that we have done to fight the pandemic and to start building back better in a gender-responsive manner, in a greener manner, and in an inclusive manner. Earlier this year, we also lost a founding mother of UNIFEM and an inspiration to UN women, Margaret Pearse Snyder, who is known to many of you, who's also referred to as UN's first feminist. Her passing has touched all of us at this time when we are forging alliances to extend the base of the stakeholders who are fighting for gender equality and working hard to attract investments towards the work that you all do. The 65th session on the Commission on the Status of Women's theme this year is women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence against women. We are inviting all of you to participate as actively as you can, engage your delegations in the usual way, make sure that we get bold outcomes at the end and that they are challenging their own countries to be decisive about the inclusion of women in public life and everywhere. We are alarmed by the fact that 80% of COVID task team around the world are predominantly made up of men who have to solve problems that disproportionately affect women, such as violence against women, the massive loss of jobs, the burden of unpaid care, the many households that are now led by children. All of that cannot be solved by men alone without the insights of women. So we urge you to push for agreed conclusion that highlight the urgency of engaging and involving women. We also ask you to urge your delegations to support your efforts on generation equality. And thank you for all the work that you have done so far. Thank you to the young people, and thank you to civil society, to private sector, to governments who have taken us this far. At this point, we are preparing for Mexico, which comes at the end of this month, and of course to Paris in June. Both these will be inflection points for gender equality. And now I would like to invite the Secretary-General to provide opening remarks. And once the Secretary-General has spoken, we'll open the floor for questions and answers. And I'd like to suggest those of you who wish to ask questions identify themselves in the chat box so that we can see you on the screen. You can also make sure that your question is on the chat box, and we'll try to group your questions according to themes as well as geographically. And we will then give the Secretary-General an opportunity to answer the questions in batches of 3. Please keep your microphone muted all the time. And unfortunately, due to technical limitations related to this platform, we do not have sign language, but we will have interpretation in all 6 UN languages. At this point, I respectfully ask the Secretary-General to deliver his remarks. Thank you.
Friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is a great pleasure to join you today. And my priority is not to answer questions, it's to listen, to hear your opinions, to hear your suggestions, and of course, to be able to incorporate them in our own thinking and policies. But first, please allow me to say a few words about the past year and what it has meant for progress on women's rights and gender equality. We are seeing new evidence almost every day that the social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating for women's rights, and particularly the rights of the most vulnerable and marginalized: poor women, women working in the informal economy, indigenous women. According to the World Bank, women in Latin America and the Caribbean were 44% more likely than men to lose their jobs at the onset of the crisis. UNICEF reported last week that up to 10 million more girls are at risk of becoming child brides as a result of the pandemic. And gender-based violence was an emergency even before the COVID. In the past year, as many women have been trapped at home with their abusers and others have been subjected to online abuse and harassment, it has become a shadow pandemic that will continue well after COVID is over. School closures and overburdened elder and healthcare services have laid bare the hidden cost of the care economy on women and the inequalities this perpetuates. An estimated 12 million women were unable to access sexual and reproductive health services as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, with disruption of supplies and services lasting an average of 3.5 months. Despite these serious setbacks to gender equality and women's rights, there is a huge gender gap in the task forces and panels that are supposed to be building the recovery. And there is simply no excuse for this. Male-dominated teams will come up with male-dominated solutions. We cannot go back to the failed man-made policies that have resulted in the fragility we see around us, in healthcare systems, in social protection, in access to justice, and in the well-being of our planet. We need to take the opportunity of a reset based on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to ensure that everyone enjoys the right of life, dignity, and security on a healthy planet. And we need to localize the Sustainable Development Goals, working with you, our civil society partners, to deliver real change on the ground. The Spotlight Initiative to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls can also provide a new model for such partnerships with both national governments and the civil society. And civil society is involved in its design, implementation, monitoring, and decision-making at all levels. The Spotlight Initiative is working towards the goal of making most of its investments in local civil society groups. Dear civil society representatives, women need to be front and center of the recovery from the pandemic, not as a matter of charity, not even as a matter of justice and basic human rights, although this is true, but as a matter of economics, of efficiency and effectiveness, of social and community resilience. Women's full representation and leadership are a prerequisite for making the best use of all our resources. Women have proven this once again during the pandemic. Women, essential and frontline workers, including health workers, have kept institutions, communities, and societies afloat. Women leaders have won widespread praise for making decisions based on science, demonstrating their sound judgment and foresight leading their countries. And in many cases, the results speak for themselves in lives saved and jobs protected. Gender equality is a question of power. We still live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. And if a few women leaders are not enough. It is when we have many women in power that we can transform power itself. I've always been committed to women's equal participation. When I was sworn in as Secretary-General, I made clear I was determined to bring equal numbers of women into senior leadership positions, which we achieved ahead of schedule last year. And we are now pushing for parity at all levels in line with my strategy for UN reform. My call to action on human rights is mobilizing the United Nations system around the use of temporary special measures and quotas to support women's equal representation and participation. Looking forward, our proposals for a reinvigorated multilateralism, our common agenda, will be founded on gender equality. Women and girls will be central to all our future planning. We need a more inclusive, networked multilateralism that recognizes the strengths that comes through diversity. We cannot talk about inclusive multilateralism without including all the world's population. Dear friends, the COVID-19 crisis has created an opportunity we must seize. We must reignite the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals and chart a path to more equal, just, inclusive, sustainable economies and societies. I'm calling on leaders in all sectors to step up and take 5 transformative actions to build women's representation, participation, and leadership. First, realize women's equal rights by repealing all discriminatory laws and enacting positive measures. Second, take concrete steps, including special measures like quotas, so that women have equal representation everywhere, on company boards, in the media, at academic institutions, and in parliaments and governments. Third, support women's economic inclusion by enabling them to join and remain in the workforce in decent jobs with equal pay and a living wage. Protect their jobs in both the formal and informal sectors, give them equal access to credit, and invest in the care economy and social protection. Fourth, I'm calling on all countries to address violence against women and girls through emergency plans backed by funding, policies, and political will. And fifth, make space for the intergenerational transition that is underway. Seek out and support the young women leaders who are advocating everywhere for a more just and equal world. The upcoming Generation Equality Forum, convened by UN Women and co-hosted by the governments of Mexico and France, will be an important opportunity to advance this agenda. Governments, corporations, civil society, young people, and change makers from all sectors will come together to define and announce ambitious investments and policies. And financing is essential. I look forward to participating, and I'm confident many of you here today will play a major part in its success. Dear activists and friends, in the past year, the United Nations has placed women at the center of our own COVID-19 response and recovery. We undertook one of the first assessments of the impact of the pandemic on women globally. And my call for a global ceasefire was supported by women peace builders around the world. And I then reiterated and expanded the call into an appeal for an end to all violence everywhere, including at home. In response to the alarming increase in violence against women and girls, the United Nations has repeatedly urged authorities to keep shelters open and to move services online. We have stressed that sexual and reproductive health services are essential and must be fully operational and accessible even in a pandemic. Our COVID Response Fund has earmarked resources for gender-sensitive programming, and I convened eminent women economists to brainstorm new approaches and solutions to address the impact of the pandemic on trade, financial flows, and the jobs that we need for a sustainable recovery. Around the world, we advocated with member states to ensure that women entrepreneurs are targeted in stimulus packages, that women working in the informal economy can access social protection, that recovery packages include greater investment in the care economy. Because, as the founding director of UNIFEM, Peg Snyder, once wrote, raising women's economy independence has a transformative potential for women, their families, and their countries, end quote. I was sorry to learn that Ms. Snyder's passed away recently, and I'm glad to have the opportunity with you to recognize her groundbreaking work. dear activists and friends, after a difficult year, there are now signs of hope thanks to the vaccines that have been developed in record time. But we should not talk of getting back to normal. It has become clear that what was considered normal was even discriminatory, unjust, and unsustainable. You are at the vanguard of the movement towards a safer, fairer, more inclusive, and equal world. The United Nations stands with you today and every day. We will continue to work closely with you as we emerge from the pandemic and reignite the decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you. And now I look forward to listen to your ideas, to your suggestions, to your proposals, and even to your criticism of what we are doing, because they are absolutely essential for us to make sure that we do the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SG. We will now take the first three questions. And the first three people to ask questions are Hauri, the NGO CSW chair, who will be followed by Dumi Komanyana of Frontline AIDS, and then Tanya Lalmon of Women Rights LGBTI. Can I also ask that whenever you ask a question in the chat, you write the name of your organization? Over to you, Hauri.
Thank you, Madame Phumzile, Your Excellency. Thank you for this opportunity and for always being a supporter of civil society and gender equality. My name is Huri Gedelekian. I am the chair of NGO CSW New York, a coalition of global gender equality activists with almost 45,000 followers. Every year, we help gather those who may not have a chance to participate during Commission on the Status of Women within the UN walls. Every year, we see the number of participants rise. This year, we are also helping convene generation equality forums. When the pandemic hit and began organizing our virtual platform, and I am proud to report from our Global Planning Committee, we are right now hosting 25,000 advocates on our virtual platform with more than 700 events, including youth-led events and addressing anti-racism, among other issues. The international feminist movement is strong, large, and growing, and organized in our campaign to stop violence against all women and girls, including women in leadership positions. This year, we are pleased to report CSW 65 is more global, more diverse, and more inclusive, with the youth movement leading the way. Our question to you is, would you support making sure that gender-based violence and violence against women becomes a standing agenda item for CSW until 2030? As you know, GBV and violence against women prevents women from exercising all human rights. The global spike in the second epidemic affects the 12 critical areas of concern in the Beijing Platform for Action, including women's decision-making in the climate justice emergency, access to IT, and ending poverty. Thank you so much for considering this.
Dumi?
Thank you, Mayor Phumzile, and thank you, Your Excellency. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Dumi Komanyani, and I work for Frontline AIDS as the programs lead for adolescent and youth programs. In His Excellency's address, one of the things that came out strongly was the issue around justice. And recently, over 140 UN member states answered the UN Secretary-General's appeal by committing to make the prevention and reparation of violence against women and girls a key part of the COVID-19 response. In sub-Saharan Africa, many countries continue to engage with GBV, but it's usually on an optional basis, and less so as COVID-19 takes its toll on state resources. For many of us, justice remains an option and a far-fetched reality. Although many of the countries have progressive legislation, implementation remains fraught with challenges, including poor resource allocation to response. I'm also a member of the Spotlight reference groups. And one of the things that I would like to put to the SG as well is that the Spotlight initiative provides an incredible opportunity for greater engagement of young women, as well as linking them to broader national level spaces. In my work, what we're seeing and what I'd like to also put to the meeting is that it's important to leverage lessons learned from the global HIV response to adapt to the current twin pandemics of gender-based violence and COVID-19. With limited access to sexual reproductive health services, as well as the political influence over the COVID-19 vaccine and ongoing pushback on CSE, we are in danger of not meeting our targets across multiple global development goals and indicators. My question, therefore, is how is the UN encouraging other global players to support young women to combat GBV globally and to be better supported to take up space in key decision-making platforms to address the intersection of gender-based violence and HIV in the ongoing context of COVID-19? Thank you.
Can I please ask people to be short? Try to get to the questions quicker. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Nandini Tanya Lalman from Mauritius, and I am a UN Religion Fellow at Outright Action International, speaking on behalf of the LGBTI Caucus, a cross-regional group of 300 organizations and more from every region of the world. Full and effective participation in public life is a prerequisite for assuring that the interests of every group are adequately represented and no community is left behind. The near absence of lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and gender non-conforming women, girls, and people from local councils, political parties, trade unions, professional and industrial associations with public and political life has resulted in them facing barriers to access and exercise their rights. My question is, in May 2020, the Office of the Secretary-General of the United Nations launched a policy brief on older persons. Almost 1 year later, what are the actions that have been taken for a people-centered recovery from COVID-19, specifically to ensure healthcare access and equity issues facing LGBTI seniors who often remain hidden from view? Thank you for your consideration.
Phumzile, do you want me to answer now? Hello, Phumzile. Can you hear me?
We cannot hear her. Okay, we can't.
Can you hear me?
They have it muted.
Huh?
They're muted.
No.
They cannot hear us. I mean, we can.
Phumzile, if you can hear me, please give a signal.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interventions. And may I say that there is one single area in which I disagree. It's the use of the word excellency. Excellency is a word banned in our work. And I even have for the people that come here and have meetings with me, when they call excellency, there is a fine of $1,000 to help us solve the financial problems of the UN. So please don't use more the word excellency. You can call me Antonio, SG, Secretary-General, whatever you want, but no excellencies, please. Now, I would like, first of all, to thank Ms. Huri for his very important intervention, and especially for what it revealed of the enormous dynamism of women's movements around the world, and the strengths of the civil society and of women's organizations that is absolutely essential to make things change. Now, I fully support that permanent inclusion of the questions of gender-based violence in the agenda of the CSW, but I would say it's not only the CSW, it's more important in the Security Council. we need to make sure that the questions of gender-based violence are absolutely central in all our aspects related both to peace and security in general, to the questions of addressing conflict, preventing conflict, sustainable peace, but also in relation to the fabrics of societies, to the violence that exists in companies, to the violence that exists in institutions, to the violence that exists at home. And all these aspects need to be fully incorporated. And this is related to the question of Ms. Tumi. I mean, the question for me is clear. We live, as I said in my intervention, in a male-dominated culture. And in a male-dominated culture, violence against women tends to be minimized. I can tell you a personal experience. 25 years ago, I was Prime Minister of Portugal. And we felt that there was a hidden problem in our country, a problem that nobody talked about. It was family violence against women. And we launched a very in-depth campaign related to the hiring many more women as police officers, training police, training the judiciary, and making campaigns in order to make that problem a problem that the society would assume as a problem to be solved. And you can't imagine the difficulties, the resistance that there was, to the extent that just 2 years ago, at the time, a member of my government that is now Prime Minister had to launch a similar campaign. These are things that are deeply rooted in a male-dominated culture, the minimization of the problems of violence against women. As if they were, minor questions, and this is not so important. And so, it is absolutely essential that we keep a very strong, a permanent campaign. And I believe that the young generations have here a key role to play, because I feel young people is less prejudiced. Young people has a better understanding. In young people, it's possible to have a gender equality-based culture than in relation to older generations that sometimes are very, very difficult to convince. And we will do everything possible to support young people's movements on this. Now, I mentioned in my intervention to member states that was yesterday that one of the important questions that need to be addressed are exactly the questions related to equality of rights for LGBTQ plus people, and in particular women that have been, I would say, double victims. And many of the situations that you have described show that. In my call to action on human rights, this was also a central issue. And this is a question that is, for me, essential. Leave no one behind is the motto of the UN Agenda 2030. Discrimination is something that is unacceptable in any area, and also in relation to people of these different groups of LGBTQ+. So you can count on our clear commitment. We have an important work inside the UN with the association of colleagues that are particularly interested on this, working with us, and this is central to our human rights approach globally.
Thank you. Thank you, SD. We now are going to take the next 3 questions. Naval Saleh of SAWA, Gro Lindstad of Focus, and Ida Saucedo of ANCIE-FEM. Starting with Nawal, please. And please be short. Can you hear me?
Buenos días, Aida Saucedo desde México. En México estamos muy preocupados por la violencia que se está disparando. 10 mujeres mueren diario. Necesitamos el apoyo de las Naciones Unidas para que en nuestro país deje de existir la violencia. Son 10 mujeres, 10 de nosotras pueden estar muriendo el día de hoy. Y nuestro presidente parece no hacer caso a las denuncias sociales de todas las mujeres que estamos en contra de los feminicidios, los cuales inician incluso desde el vientre de la madre. Por favor, secretario, es muy importante que estas políticas públicas para erradicar la violencia contra las mujeres sean efectivas, sean iguales y sean complementarias para hombres y para mujeres. Es muy importante que, como nosotros seremos dentro del foro de igualdad, que también se traduzca en apoyos para nuestro país. No podemos permanecer sin tener de las Naciones Unidas, pero además necesitamos el apoyo de todas las mujeres en el mundo. Estamos muriendo y el presidente lo único que ha comentado en sus noticiarios en la mañana es ya chole, que es una frase en español, en mexicano, que significa ya no estén molestando con estas noticias.
Thank you. Nawal? Nawal, over to you. Nawal, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
I am Nawal Dallali from Lebanon, the director of Sawa Football Association. I want to talk about the critical situation in Lebanon, the crisis, and we have the COVID-19 crisis also. Only 10% of the population have the vaccine, and hospitals are full of corona cases. And in this situation, how can we help women and girls? We are working on the prevention of violence against women and early child marriage also. So the cases of violence against women increases in this year 100%. So in this situation, how can we help the women and the girls to prevent the violence against them and stop the child marriage? We need help from the United Nations to take care of our country and that we can help women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have Grow, please?
Me.
Grow? Grow, are you there?
I am there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
Perfect. Thank you very much for allowing me to ask a question. And Mr. Secretary-General, it's good to see you back again for yet another year of this town meeting. My question is as follows. With the global pandemic putting pressure on economies in most countries, the wealthy donor countries will most likely look to use more of their budgets nationally and less on development, and most likely less on gender equality and women's empowerment. So my question to you is, how do we jointly work together to put pressure on the development donors to keep up their funding and to prioritize funding to gender equality and women's empowerment? Thank you.
Thank you, Grow. Over to you, Secretary-General.
Well, muchas gracias, señora Saucedo, por su intervención. El apelo que nosotros hicimos en relación con la violencia contra las mujeres, y sobre todo la violencia en el seno de las familias, tuve un apoyo explícito de más de 150 gobiernos. Pero el apoyo explícito no es suficiente, como usted ha afirmado. Estamos ahora trabajando con los países, con nuestros equipos de país fuertemente involucrados en eso, para que cada país tenga un plan de acción contra la violencia doméstica y la violencia contra mujeres en general. Y puede usted estar confiante que vamos a entrar en contacto con el gobierno de México para estar seguro que también en México haya un plan de acción determinado para combatir todas las formas de violencia contra las mujeres, incluyendo la violencia que se pasa dentro de casa. Muchas gracias por su información, que es muy útil para nosotros. Ms. Nawal, I have to apologize. I'm not sure if I could hear well your intervention and your questions. There was a problem of sound, and I'm a little bit deaf myself. But I understand you mentioned both violence and child marriage. And I think the question of child marriage is a very important question, not only in itself. I mean, it's a dramatic thing that so many young girls are forced into marriage because of the extreme poverty of their families, or because of insecurity problems and the way their families see as a solution, when it is not a solution. It is another problem that makes it even more serious and more dramatic. Not only the problems of gender equality, but the violations of human rights. What the increase in child marriage is revealing today is the dramatic impact of the COVID-19 in the situation of women in general and of girls. We see girls much more impacted than boys in relation to school closures, and a meaningful number of girls are out of school. I believe we have 743 million girls out of schools, and 111 million in LDCs. On the other hand, as many of the developing countries have a large informal economy, and the informal economy was dramatically impacted by COVID, and most of the countries have no mechanisms to support the informal economy. We saw more and more families going into poverty, more and more women going into poverty, and because of that, child marriage becoming, for many of them, and this is a big mistake, but in any case, in their, backward vision, a solution that they try to find. And on the other hand, the fact that the levels of poverty and hunger are increasing in the world makes women particularly vulnerable, and young girls particularly vulnerable, and we see this dramatic increase in child marriage. This is central to all our programs, all our advocacy programs. And of course, the most important aspects that we have to address is the root causes of it. There are root causes that are political, that are cultural, but there are now specific root causes linked to the economy and to the COVID-19 impact. And what we have been pushing, first of all, is through a global commitment in order to support debt relief and to support the provision of much higher levels of liquidity. And this is related also to the third intervention that was made. What has happened now is that developed countries have injected trillions of dollars in their economies, but developing countries have not the capacity to do so. So we launched, together with Jamaica and Canada, that are the two countries that preside the group of friends of Sustainable Development Finance, we launched an initiative. We already had 3 summits. We're going to have another. And we put a number of proposals on the table for the G7, for the G20, for the IMF, for the World Bank, exactly to make sure that developing countries are provided with resources through the issuing of special drawing rights, which is the modern way to print money, through increased support by the international financial institutions, through increase of development aid. And it is unfortunately true that in some countries we see development aid being reduced, which is totally unacceptable in the present moment, especially when they are spending trillions with their own economies. And also putting an emphasis in the work of our country teams, working with governments to make sure that in the recovery there is a special concern with social protection, a special concern with the informal economy, and a special concern with the impact on women and the impact on poor families, exactly to allow to fight more effectively both gender violence and child marriage and other forms. Girls giving up on education and other terrible impacts that are witnessing now. And this is, of course, clearly in line with the third question that was raised. We are actively engaged with all these actors in order to make sure that the present very unfair response to COVID-19, unfair in vaccination, in which, I am in a country where 15% of the population was vaccinated. There are many countries in the world where not one single dose has been distributed until now. So unfortunately, we are seeing a terrible, unfair distribution of vaccination that will have a dramatic impact in the recovery of the economies of the developing world, but also unfair in relation to the mobilization of resources for the recovery, in which we have trillions, as I mentioned, being used and spent in the countries that have the capacity to generate them, and where unfortunately the support to the developing world is still extremely small in comparison with the needs that exist. This is an essential battle for us, and we are totally committed to it. The Deputy Secretary-General has been a permanent champion. She's all the time, not only together with me, advocating, but directly engaging all the key actors to make sure that things change and to make sure that there is an effective, just response to the COVID economic and social impacts, which is, of course, a basic condition for the problems of gender equality to be effectively addressed.
Thank you, SG. The next questions here from Girls Glen International, Lisa from Ladley Foundation, Devendra from International Alliance of Women. Over to you here.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for considering youth perspectives. I could not be more grateful to the United Nations for considering the perspectives of young girls such as myself. I am 17 years old and I am from Saudi Arabia and India. My question is, how can we hold member states accountable to following through with the actions that they have ratified on international legislation pieces, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Beijing Platform for Action? Oftentimes, international legislation is only codified, but not made binding for all member states and agencies. So how can we hold member states accountable? And how can we make sure that they are upholding international law to propel women's rights and girl rights equity internationally? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity and this great space and discussion. My name is Lisa Ordóñez from International Justice Mission in Colombia. And Mr. Secretary-General, my question is, what is the UN doing to increase resources to make justice systems more responsive to crimes against women? Not just to provide justice for one woman, but to create a deterrent effect on would-be abusers. There needs to be a great scale on response and services to make justice swift, transparent, and predictable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liza. Devendra? Devendra, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. My question is this, that everybody is working to strengthen the feminism, and it is good that we are working for that. But in a country like India, where millions of women are suffering, just they are not getting the primary health care even. So when we will start to save the women first, when we will start to save the adolescent first, when we will start a drive where we will be against the female infanticide, we are talking about gender equality. It is good. Even we also had a question, very big event in India in 2017, where 25,000 people, male dominating society, or we can say the male population, were gathered together to uphold the idea of gender equality. But since then I am working here, and the big question arises when I have diagnosed more than 3 lakh females in India through our initiatives, and we found that they are suffering from multiple diseases, multiple transferable diseases, HIV, STDs. They are anemic, and we are working on the gender equality. It is good, but when we will save the women, then we can have the idea of the gender equality. This is my first question. Also, we are working on a child marriages also. So this is, I just want to ask then, when we will take it as a primarily agenda to save the women in making their healthcare as a priority. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devendra. Over to SG.
Well, first of all, Miss Here, you have asked the $1 million question. I mean, how can we make the states accountable for violations of human rights in general and of women's rights in particular? We have some mechanisms. We have the Human Rights High Commissioner. We have the capacity to denounce situations. We have some, different envoys, human rights envoys, that are very active in denouncing abuses of different kinds, and of course, namely in relation to women's rights. We have treaty bodies, and those treaty bodies are supposed to. But let's be clear. I mean, the truth is, most of the violations of human rights that exist in the world, and in particular violations against women, are not punished. I mean, and the truth is that the mechanisms of the international community to make states accountable are very weak. I have an expression I use many times, is that we have a multilateralism without teeth. And it is true. I mean, we have principles, we have policies, we have strategies, there is even international law, but it is very difficult to go over the obstacles that national sovereignty put to the intervention of multilateral organizations in relation to making sure that the perpetrators of the worst violations of human rights, and namely of rights against women, sometimes governments themselves, legislations in itself, are indeed held accountable. So we have a gap there, and we have to recognize it, because only recognizing the truth we are able to move things. If we pretend that we have fantastic instruments and that everything is going well, we are just lying, and I don't think that it is based on lies that we can make progress. Ms. Liz has asked, how can we have deterrent mechanisms in relation to violence against women? I mean, the most important thing is that deterrence to exist based on laws enacted by countries and based on the proper training of police forces and of courts to make sure that the laws are implemented and the perpetrators are indeed punished. This is the most important way as a deterrent. But obviously, if we address the root causes, and the root causes are many that I have already spoken about, both from the economic point of view, discrimination of different sorts, from the point of views of the levels of development, from the point of view of cultural biases, etc. If we do not address the root causes, it's not only because we have judicial systems that work well that we'll be able to end violence against women. We need to address the root causes of violence against women independently of the necessity to have effective deterrence through the laws and through the implementation of laws and punishment of perpetrators. Now, I'm not sure if I understood well, Mr. Devendra, but I mean, it is exactly because in many countries we have dramatic basic problems in healthcare, in the economy, in income, in education, and we have whole areas of the population that have no access to basic services. This is not a reason to put gender equality as a secondary issue, because if those situations exist, the biggest victims of those situations are essentially women. And so, obviously, it's not enough to fight for gender equality. We need to fight for adequate health care, including sexual and reproductive health care. We need to fight for education for all. We need to fight to support by, for instance, basic income being provided. I remember Brazil, at a certain moment, they instituted the Bolsa Familia, which was a basic form of support to poor families, that all poor families would benefit, to guarantee that they would have a minimum. And several other countries have adopted measures of this sort. Others have more difficulty to do so. So we need to, of course, address the most dramatic economic and social problems, and we need to denounce the injustices of this world, the unfair globalization that we have unfortunately lived in for decades, that are responsible for those terrible situations affecting large sectors of the population in so many countries of the world. Even in developed countries, we have poor areas. I mean, we have racism and other forms of discrimination that make poverty be unevenly distributed. And if I'm in the US, the Afro-American community, for instance, has a much more dramatic impact, the problems of poverty, the problems of health, etc., than other sectors of the population. So, I mean, it is clear that we need to address those basic problems, but it is clear that when those basic problems exist, the biggest victims are women. And so gender equality must be embedded in the way, and gender equality policies must be embedded in the way we address the most basic gaps of development and the well-being that any country has in relation to their populations. And of course, one of the big campaigns, you mentioned healthcare, that we are engaged in is for universal healthcare. And universal health care is, I would say, one of the most important objectives of the United Nations. And in universal health care, obviously, all the questions related to sexual and reproductive rights, but all the questions also related to mental health that is dramatically impacted by the COVID, and all the questions related to, the most vulnerable areas of the population, people with different forms of handicap, indigenous populations, etc. I mean, it's essential that policies to develop healthcare in a country are done in an equal basis and address the difficulties of all sectors of the population. So let's be clear, let's address the dramatic gaps in development, the dramatic gaps in poverty that exists in the world, the dramatic situation of all areas of the population. But let's never forget that women are the main victims and that those problems will never be solved if gender equality is not embedded in the policies addressed to them.
Thank you, SG. Now we're going to take the last 3 questions. Cheryl, International Alliance of Women; Solange, Sociologists for Women in Society; and Alliance Creative Community Project. So we will start with Cheryl. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Your Excellency, Madam
No excellency,
Secretary.
please. No excellency, please.
I know, sir. Thank you so much. I just want to bring to your attention the question of women in leadership and their role in service and in society, particularly in the political arena, where even when women have the opportunity to achieve those positions, that there is a barrier, a culture of resistance against women in those spaces. And so while women may make it to those spaces and places of decision-making and leadership in society, we still have to contend with a culture that is anti-feminist. And so how do we break those barriers down so that we're creating safe spaces for women, not only for them to access those spaces, but for them to thrive and survive in those spaces so that they can have a positive impact on the decision making in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Solange?
And I'm the lead delegate for Sociologists for Women in Society in the United States. The main theme for this year's CSW is women's political participation, the promotion of women in public life and decision making. And I'd like to congratulate you, Secretary-General António Guterres, for strongly supporting women's political representation and in positions of power throughout the world, and specifically for promoting gender parity at the United Nations system. Well, my question is, what's being done to make sure that at the end of your term, the next Secretary General for the United Nations is a woman and a feminist?
That was the last question. Oh, sorry, Anne, you are the last one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Secretary General and team, for putting this town hall together. My question is, many countries around the world are going through colonial hangover or aftershock. Patriarchy, capitalism, poverty, political unrest, and war are all partly a result of colonial rulers. This has left women and children in those countries, South Asian countries, more vulnerable to violence, poverty, and more. Sri Lanka is a great example. Pre-colonial Sri Lanka operated as 3 kingdoms. Since the British left the country in the majority Sinhala government, all minority groups are going through ethnic cleansing, in particular the Tamil community. Canada is still under a colonial system where indigenous people's rights are not tangible yet. In Canada, indigenous people in certain regions don't have clean water. Yet decolonial work is not part of any of our conversation in this country or all over the world, or I haven't seen it in the UN either. When are we going to talk about decolonial work? And Mr. Secretary General, I want to know what that should look like, decolonial work. What should it look like? I want to hear your insight and input.
Thank you. Secretary General, these are all the questions. I will hand over to you to answer the questions as well as to do closing remarks. Thank you very much, SG.
First of all, in relation to the first 2 questions, Ms. Cheryl, and I'm terribly sorry I couldn't understand the name of the second colleague that has spoken, are directly related to the questions of power. And I believe this is the central question. The central question is a question of power. I mean, as I said in my intervention, we live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, and it is the uneven distribution of power that allows everything else to happen. I mean, power at political level, power at the level of the private sector and the economy, power even at family level. Now, the truth is that only 22 countries have women leaders in the world, in 193. The truth is that less than 25% of parliamentarians are women, and less than 1% of women with less than 30 years. And if you look at corporate boards, you see the number of women being extremely reduced. Now, how can we fight it? I mean, power needs to be fought with power. I mean, so we need to mobilize societies, and we need to mobilize men that understand that this is something that in the end is negative for everybody, including for the men themselves. We need to mobilize everybody to make sure that we are able to break this kind of cycle in which if we would wait for normal things to happen, I remember that in a calculation that we made, we would need to wait 130 years to have parity at the level of heads of state and government in the world. So I am strongly in favor of exceptional measures, namely quotas. 25 years ago, I introduced a quota of 30% at the time, 33, 1/3, in all the posts of my political party. Our party tried to make it approved in Parliament. We were defeated by all the other parties for all the places in the state apparatus, I would say. But I think we need to fight for exceptional measures and to make sure that they are effectively implemented. I mean, and it's a matter of political will. I mean, here, when I came, we had less than 1/3 of women in the higher responsibility positions in the UN. Today, in the 200 leaders of the UN system, we have basically 100 women and 100 men. Sometimes it's 99, 101, 199, because it varies with people leaving and people coming, but it's parity permanently. And the same with resident coordinators that are the leaders of the UN at country level, because those things depended on my appointment. And as it depends on my appointment, I can force it. So in all the other situations in the UN, it's more complicated, but we are making progress. I want to have parity at all levels and at all levels of the organization. And I believe that it is absolutely essential to make these questions of women's presence from corporate boards. For instance, we strongly encourage all the mechanisms, and there are already some asset management entities that force the presence of women in the companies that they own or where they have important shares. More and more in general assemblies of companies, there are motions for parity at the level of the boards. So we need to fight in all fronts because, as I said, it's a question of power, and power usually is not given, it's taken. So we need to fight in all fronts and use all possible instruments in order to make sure that we break this vicious cycle that makes it difficult for gender parity to happen. But we have something that is helping us, is that when one looks at universities today around the world, we have more women than men. Even in Saudi Arabia, we have more women than men in universities. And we are seeing progressively in the public sectors of the world, women occupying more and more positions. Private sector has been more difficult, but I think many are moving in that direction. And I think it is irreversible, this movement, but it will take time. And what we need is to accelerate. And we'll only accelerate with exceptional measures like the ones I mentioned. Now, I have to say that one of the problems that existed when I was elected Secretary-General was that there was an important movement for a woman Secretary-General, and I respected a lot that movement. The point is that this is a problem I cannot solve in relation to myself. I am a man. I'm sorry. There is nothing I can do about it. I fight for gender parity at all levels, and I believe it will be very important that more presidents and prime ministers and more leaders of international organizations, including the UN, are women. And I think it's perfectly reasonable and perfectly, positive, the campaign that exists for women to be also leader of the United Nations. I couldn't solve that problem when myself was a candidate. I believed that there were reasons for me, based on my idea of public service, to be a candidate. And as I said, this is a problem I cannot solve. But I can fight for parity at all levels. I cannot fight for parity inside myself because I cannot be divided into two. But I can fight for gender parity as a central objective of my political engagement in the past and of my engagement as an international civil servant now. Colonialism. I mean, in the intervention I made to the so-called Mandela, the Mandela conferences organized by the Nelson Mandela Foundation, I said that two central reasons in the origin of inequality are colonialism and patriarchy. And I was even criticized by some publications of the extreme right because the use of that. I do recognize, I come from a country that was a colonialist country, and I know exactly what it means. I mean, even if as a politician, I was always in favor of those that were fighting both the dictatorship in my country and the colonial exploitation of countries by Portugal in Africa, especially, but not only in Africa, but especially in Africa. So it is clear that we still have a huge legacy of colonialism, as we still have a legacy from slavery and transatlantic slavery. Namely, this is something that we are discussing this week exactly. And that legacy, I mean, countries are victim of the colonial past and are victim of the impact of the colonial past in the fabrics of society. And this is something that is, of course, something that needs to be recognized. We have been recognizing it publicly, and we have been recognizing it through our own institutions. We still have a very important area of work on decolonization. There is a decolonization committee that I fully support. I always go to their key meetings around the world. There are actions around the world. And there is a question that you mentioned, which is how to address the legacy of colonialism in our societies. And this is true, by the way, both for societies that colonize and societies that were colonized. That legacy needs to be addressed in both. This is a central discussion today in my country. If you look at what's happening in my country, the discussions are, that is in the top news, that discussion about the past. And I believe it is extremely important for countries that were the victims of colonial exploitation to be supported in the efforts to definitely get rid of the legacy and to be able to develop the mechanisms and the institutions and the movements and the corrections in injustices that were a legacy from the colonial systems.
Thank you, SG. You can, SG, make your closing remarks.
Well, my closing remarks are of gratitude for your very important participation in this debate, but especially telling you that without your role, without the mobilization of the civil society, without your intervention at all levels, this is a battle we cannot win. As I said, this is a question of power. Power is not given, it must be taken. And you need to be an essential instrument in taking power in favor of gender equality. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, SG. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, DSG. You hear we go and participate in the negotiations to the extent that we can and accelerate the participation of women in all decision-making bodies. And I want to remind you that March 23rd, 10 a.m., we will memorialize the life of Margaret Snyder. Please log in and participate in the celebration of her life. Thank you so much. I hit the gong.